our lives. We can wonder how this means for communities on the other side of the tech divide. Would it mean better lives and better opportunities? Or how do we make a sense of the massive learning slide of the children in the villages? Pandemic has changed our perspective on how technology supported areas access to healthcare. In state like Jharkhand, TRIF has worked with National Health Mission to roll out e-Sanjeevani across the states, and this became a go-to lifeline for them. Similarly, Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile DBT has changed the entirety of the welfare delivery architecture. Making sense of trends and pathways on what the people like us interested in rural prosperity, resilience, and growth can do, we have the finest minds guiding us. Here on a panel, we have Ganesh Natarajan joins us from Bangalore. Ganesh, thank you for making time, even if you're traveling. Ganesh is executive chairman and founder of 5F World, a platform for digital startups, skills, and social ventures in the country. He's a member of the Central Board of Directors of SBI and chairman of the board of Honeywell Automation India Limited, and Global Talent Track, a pioneer in employability skills training in Asia, and Skills Alpha, a new digital platform venture to transform learning processes in organization and society. Madan Padaki, to helm this future-focused conversation, is the co-founder of Head Held High Foundation, a non-profit that focuses on initiatives of poverty eradication through economic employment. He has also founded One Bridge in 2014 as a platform that empowers rural entrepreneurs to accelerate the abundance of access, choice, and convenience to rural citizens, leveraging technology, and co-founded Global Alliance for Mass Entrepreneurship. Professor Sanjiva Prasad, as head of computer department at IIT Delhi, apart from students, mentored many startups across healthcare education. He's a Gandhian and has first-hand tutorship. Both his parents were well-known freedom fighters. Thank you for joining us, sir. Amit Singh is an executive director with the Deloitte Consulting. Amit has a career spanning over 20 years, primarily in the areas of technology and management consulting, largely in the public sector space across different competencies and market. Amit has worked on marquee projects such as India's unique identification projects, e-Panchayat Mission Mode project for Ministry of Panchayati Raj, automation of food security program of India, National Repository of Birth and Death Registrations, etc. Thank you for joining us, sir. Carlos will be joining us from London. Thank you for making time. Carlos is the Public Policy Manager for EMEA and LATAM in Data for Good at Meta, building partnerships between governments, civil society, academia to create positive social impact by leveraging the advantages of data and technology. Without much ado, I'll hand it over to Madan ji to take the session ahead and have more excitement. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarvi. Thanks a lot to the organizers for getting us all together, and delighted to be here with all of you. Look forward to a very scintillating future-forward conversation. And I was just reflecting as we were preparing for this session that it was not too far ago that I remember standing in a queue to buy a train ticket from Mumbai to Bangalore. You had to get there at 4:30 in the morning. And you just kept your fingers crossed that by the time the counter opens at 8 o'clock, that there are enough tickets left, right? And that bated breath when the guy was looking and saying, oh, 3-tier or a sleeper class from Bombay to Bangalore, wait, it's available or not. And then he used to say, server hanging, now wait for a second, right? I'm sure several of us will still remember going and buying those physical tickets. Then you used to hop across and wait in the queue for a cinema ticket and go hopping from one theater to another, trying to figure out where tickets are available. And at the end of the day, you waited again for an hour, waiting for the 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock to happen so that the pulse rate comes down. And you used to do an STD call to your parents back home. And you used to look at the change in your pocket and say, I have 5 rupees of talk time. So as soon as the 5 rupees happened, you cut the call and said, I'm done, right? When I was telling my kids about all this, they said, which era were you living in? Because all the 3 things don't exist today, right? Of course, the train ticket counter still exists. Very few of us go there. Movies, I don't remember the last time ever that I stood in a movie ticket queue to buy a ticket. And who has seen a PCO now, right? Peter Drucker said it beautifully. He says, the future is when technology seems like magic And tomorrow's technology is in everybody's hands today, right? And we have seen that, right? Who would ever think that you could do transactions all at the click of a button on your phone, ever? It appears like magic. If somebody had told me way back when I was standing in the queue in 2000, trying to buy a ticket to Bangalore, that was in 20 years, you will not be doing all this. You'll be just sitting and booking tickets from your home. I would have said, are you mad? I mean, I'm the one sweating here for 4 hours trying to stand in the 4:30 morning queue, right? So I'm just thinking, the thought I want to leave you guys now is just imagine we're 2020, 2022. What are the things you think will vanish by 2027? And what are the things that we do today that we have taken so much for granted that may not exist at all in 2027? And this question has a lot of implications for the conversation that we have today. That you take healthcare, you take financial services, you take education, you take livelihoods, entrepreneurship, agriculture. I believe we're at the cusp of something dramatic, and we've always been at the cusp of something dramatic 5 years hence for the last 25 years, right? To Netscape Navigator in 1995, to the dot-com boom bust, to cell phones, to smartphones, to IoT. I think the future will be as unpredictable, and that's the beauty of the future, that we can co-create it. So the larger question that I want to leave, and I want to come back to those questions as we end the session, is what are the limits to our imagination to craft a better future? Leveraging the disruptive technologies that we see are all coming. And two, what will it take for this group to co-create it? Right? How do we leverage the good of it to be able to deliver better results? Technology is like a knife. You can use it to kill somebody, you can use it to, save somebody, right? So I want to put that lens of saving somebody and figure out how do we then make sense of all the trends, all the noise, the signals. How do we get the signals from the noise that we're seeing, and what do we catch on to? Because that force is unstoppable, right? How do we ride that wave? And in that context, I just want to share that the last few years, I'll come back to that, but at OneBridge, we've been doing a lot of experiments, fascinating. I'll pepper it with some of the learnings from the ground. We have a terrific set of panelists here, multiple perspectives, and of course, this is a conversation. We have Carlos, who has joined in from London. Carlos is from Meta. Thank you for joining us here today, Carlos. We have Ganesh Natarajan, the tech sage, I would say, who has seen it all. Been there, done that, building tech companies, building app tech, and now doing several things. And if there's anybody who's dabbled with technology at the intersection of social change, Ganesh is the guy. He's going to join us shortly. He's on the road to the airport in Bangalore, which means he has a lot of time. There'll be a hell lot of traffic this evening. We have Amit, who's joined us from Deloitte. And Amit has been working with the Ministry of Rural Development, Panchayat Raj, on taking several solutions, technology solutions, to the grassroots. And Professor Sanjiva, with the academic and the research hat that you wear at IIT Delhi, you get to see a lot of bright young guys trying to do a lot of interesting things. Your perspective will be very, very useful. So we're going to have this as a conversation. I'm going to invite Carlos to start off, for a 5-minute share on where you see from a global perspective. Okay, Ganesh is joined in. Hi, Ganesh.
Hi, Madan.
Can you hear us? Oh, great. Okay, lovely. So let's get started with Carlos, then we'll come to you, Ganesh. Carlos, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all. As it has already been said, I'm joining from London. I'm Public Policy Manager for Data for Good at Meta. And it's a real pleasure to be sharing this panel with you. And I just want to touch upon something that you said about how do we co-create the future, right? Like, where are we standing? It's undeniable that we're facing global challenges that need to be addressed urgently, starting, for example, with climate change, but not limited to that. We're also in a phase of economic recovery after the pandemic that we faced. And that, from my perspective, that only can be solved if we join forces. And by joining forces, I mean a proactive collaboration between public and entities, private companies, nonprofits, NGOs, all that have different resources and tools to address these different challenges. So the limits of our imagination is also something that really resonate, and the limits of the human mind are endless. So for that, we will need to have open conversations like these, having open conversations with an open mind to explore the different tools that we have from different angles in these challenges. So let me quickly share what we're doing at Data for Good at Meta. Data for Good at Meta is a program that was built in 2017 with the purpose of only supporting nonprofits and international organizations in response to crisis, to humanitarian crisis. So for example, floodings, earthquakes, etc., wildfires. And we noticed that we have data that can be useful for them. So that's how we started building disasters map based on mobility of people, having in mind the privacy protection of our users always. Now, after 5 years, the program has evolved drastically. So we are not only working in humanitarian emergencies and crisis response, but we're also trying to look for proactive support and proactive policy making. That means that our set of tools have to increase, right? So now we have not only the tools that can support for humanitarian emergencies, but also for social development, for climate change, etc. At Data for Good, we have already more than 800 partners working in around 80 countries in topics such as climate change, economic development, energy infrastructure, etc. Let me quickly tell you about the tools that we have. So the tools that we have at Data for Good can be grouped into 3 main buckets. The first one are maps. We have one of the world's most accurate population density maps with an accuracy of 30 square meters and breakdowns by age and gender. And interestingly, it does not contain any Facebook users' data. The way that we contributed was through our computing power that we have, because we bought commercially available satellite imagery of all the world. Then we divided the world in areas of 30 square meters, and then we trained a machine learning algorithm to identify if there in those areas there was a structure or not. And then we made a collaboration with Columbia University, the worldwide experts on population, who took the latest available national census data of every country around the world and made population estimates up to 2020. And then we distributed that population in the structures that our machine learning algorithm identified. This population density map has been crucial and has been used by organizations such as the World Bank in the context of COVID-19 to estimate the number of hospitals and beds that are needed in relation to the population. But when we talk about the creativity and the limits of our human minds, it's endless, right? Having a such accurate and updated population density map is key and crucial for policy making. For example, it can be very useful for the creation of energy infrastructure to see how many people are at risk depending on the places where they live. So imagine we're talking about climate change and rising sea levels, how many people are living in coastal areas with high precision and high accuracy. When it comes to health emergencies, we can also identify the different needs and preview the different needs that different populations have, right? When the COVID-19 pandemic started, it was not the same to take a look at the people who were under 16 years old and the people who were 60 and above. And this population density map can be very useful. Another tool quickly that we have is the Relative Wealth Index. This is a very innovative map that measures how poor or wealthy is an area of 2.4 square kilometers compared to another area of the same size within each country in the world. The way we created it was using traditional and not traditional data. By traditional data, I'm referring to surveys on poverty developed by the US International Agency for Development, and non-traditional data, the data that we collect as companies, such as the number of Wi-Fi access points that we identify in the territory, the number of mobile phone devices, satellite imagery to identify the complexity of structures, etc. This Relative Wealth Index has been used by the government in Nigeria, for example, for poverty alleviation programs, and different entities have used it for also policy research. So just to conclude my intervention, we are proactively looking for partnerships with academics, NGOs, nonprofits, but also government agencies to understand where are the data gaps to then build ourselves data products with the data that we collect as a company in a privacy protecting way, and then have open conversations with them on how our tools can be integrated into the policy pipelines to support their policy research and work. So I'm happy to continue this conversation after some few interventions, and thank you very much again for the invitation.
Fascinating. Thank you, Carlos, for taking us on a zoomed out view of the maps and what the world will look like. I mean, I think it was Nandan who said that India is going to leapfrog from a data poor to a data rich country in a very short span of time. And how do we leverage that data for good? With that, Ganesh, let me bring you into the conversation. You've been witness and you've been the change maker driving a lot of technology changes in the country. What's your perspective on where the country should be, could be, will be? Maybe these are three different perspectives. And what should we be doing together to get to the ideal state that we desire?
Thank you, Madan, and thank you, folks, for inviting me to share my thoughts. See, the way I see it in this country is our biggest challenge, which, I mean, no prizes for guessing, is the jobs crisis, because there clearly is an employment, entrepreneurship opportunity, which has to be grasped with both hands. Otherwise, we run the risk of a very, very divided society.
Yeah.
And if you look at the enablers, the first enabler, of course, is the government's commitment to digital India. And in that, of course, the infrastructure component, which is definitely the National Optic Fiber Network, what we used to call BharatNet, which will enable 250,000 gram panchayats, eventually maybe 600,000 villages, to have access to Wi-Fi, access to have hopefully some modicum of broadband. So that's one. The second is the big enabler that's coming up, which Nandan Nilekani is very much the architect of, which is ONDC, which is the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which Mr. Koshi from Bangalore is now running. And that will enable multiple data interchanges to happen almost seamlessly. So it's the ultimate digital platform. Let me tell you a bit about what we are doing to kind of grasp these opportunities. The first is, of course, an entity which most people know called Educate Girls, which is putting girl children back to school, which is run by an outstanding entrepreneur called Safina Hussain. And there we are now building a complete digital capability by which we will actually, what it does is putting girl child back to school in the rural and the tribal areas of some of the weakest states, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh. So there we're putting this complete data and analytics module, which will understand the aspirations of every girl, understand the potential problems of every household, and ensure that you're tackling specific problems specific to each household or each village or each community. Second is, of course, what we run in Pune or started in Pune called Lighthouse Communities, which works with urban youth to make sure that they get agency and aspiration, and again are kind of handheld to the right skills that is appropriate and which they would like to do, and then eventually get them jobs or start them off in an entrepreneurial career. Here we are making very extensive use of technology. In fact, we're doing Google mapping for literally every household in 540 slum pockets of Pune, and now extending that logic to the whole Delhi state, as well as then to Bhubaneswar and Odisha, and eventually in Telangana, starting with Hyderabad. And here the idea is that it's a no child left behind or no dream left behind. That urban slum youth have as much of a right to dream as many of us in Bangalore or Delhi or Pune have. And how do we make those dreams come true? By a combination of identification through technology and, of course, extensive digital platforms like the ONDC, which will enable somebody with an aspiration in Delhi to collaborate with somebody in Pune or in Hyderabad. And that's really what we're moving towards. And last but not the least, I think the biggest opportunity to create employment is from the artisan communities all over the country. And here again, we're working with two entities called LHI Digital in Mumbai and an artisan integrator called People Tree. And again, the vision is, and we are now raising about $4 million of initial funding to make sure that we can identify hubs where again the artisan communities can be enabled in their operations, in their quality, international quality designs, so that they're able to up their typical artisan earning of, let's say, 7,000 rupees a month to as much as 20, 25,000. And all these will need technology. The interesting point you made about what is our dream and what will come true. I think all this can and will come true in the next 5 to 10 years if we make sure that we don't slip up on technology implementation. Sometimes as a country, we've underinvested in technology. And clearly, as the Digital India $1 trillion opportunity shows, this is the way to go. But I'm excited, Madan, because I really think that we are at a cusp in our own evolution as a country where we realize that the digital divide is real and we cannot leave the Bharat and the rural India opportunity behind. But if we can make this happen, I think everybody will find their place in the sun. And people like you and me, I'm sure, will continue to work hard to make sure that this dream is realized in whatever manner possible. So thank you and happy to stay on for any other questions.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Ganesh. I think that was very well put. And interestingly, the two panelists have brought across two large areas, right? One is, of course, the whole climate change and how it's going to affect each and every individual on the face of this earth. And therefore, it's going to change the shape of everything that we know before even we can blink. And that's the pace that's happening. And two, of course, the livelihoods challenge and the jobs challenge and the economic well-being challenge, especially of youth, as we think about in the country. And if you put these two together, maybe there's a huge opportunity itself in green jobs and green entrepreneurship that could change the face of what we're looking for with technology infused. I think let's hold that thought. We'll come back to that. Before I come to Amit, I just wanted to share an interesting thing about, this thing has always been in my mind that why does technology trickle down to rural? Everything starts off with something happening in a Bangalore or a Delhi or a Mumbai, and then you take away the bells and whistles, and then you say, okay, somehow it will work in rural. If you look at most trajectory of those technology adoptions, that's been the usual narrative. Even now, our surveys in rural India show that, well, all of us use UPI like this. The UPI penetration in the villages is less than 7%, right? It's still it's not that they don't know about it. The barriers to usage itself is still fairly high, right? So one of the experiments, and I'll keep you guys, keep this forum posted, is that I've always been fascinated with how do you leapfrog and take technology. So as we speak, we're getting ready to launch probably the world's first ever metaverse for rural consumers up this weekend. We're taking an EV showroom into the metaverse. We're having devices which will go in vans from village to village, showcasing the metaverse experience to them. We built a very, very interactive experience zone for EVs, and we have trained about 100 women entrepreneurs on how to navigate within the metaverse and how do you create experiences. And the idea is that how do you reduce the cost of distribution? How do you reduce the cost of EV manufacturer, a two-wheeler EV manufacturer setting up a gigantic distribution network? Can you cut through all of that by creating great experiences in the metaverse and by training mechanics eventually on how to repair many things? And training itself has got a massive use case in the metaverse. This is something that it's happening underway, and fingers crossed on how this whole experiment will grow and grow. So we'll bring that aspect and share it with the group as we go along. But I just want to come from that to Amit to say you've been deep inside RDPR. You've been seeing phenomenal use of technology to bring in efficiencies, to bring in transparency, to bring in data. It'll be lovely to hear your experiences on what you see on the ground and what more is likely to happen, could happen.
Thanks, Madan. So I think you have to look at from 2 points of view. One is that the rural citizen or the rural development, right? So Ministry of Rural Development or Panchayati Raj, so say, will not represent the entire rural population, right? Because I mean, rural folks have a similar needs. What Madan was talking about, they also want to, use internet for doing UPI transactions or, buy tickets or get a better healthcare and so on and so forth, right? So there are other departments also at play like education, health, food and public distribution, so on and so forth, right? So, but if you look at the same time, rural area definitely have their own peculiar challenge, right? Unlike the urban setting. So obviously they live in a gram panchayat. So just for the unaware, for example, we have got more than 250,000 gram panchayats. We have got more than 700,000 villages at this point of time, right? Now look at just for a change. I'll also talk about what government has done till now, right? For example, Ministry of Rural Development, Panchayati Raj. So if you see, I mean, you would have heard about, things good, bad and ugly, like income tax, something went wrong, right? It was all over the place, and GST and, and then UIDI, the kind of things which you are managing. But also look at the rural development. There are programs which they are running centrally and connecting more than 250,000 gram panchayats from Delhi. So most of this IT is being managed centrally from Delhi. Now imagine out of 250,000 panchayats, 200,000 panchayats, 2 lakhs, have got a digital payment means in terms of doing the digital certificates, and they make payments online, right? So if I just take one example, e-Panchayat, the Gram Swaraj application, so they would have disbursed more than $100 billion using that application. And the July itself, they would have done, some 5% of that, right? Now you take some other systems like MG Narega, right? 15 crore active workers as on date, right? 1.2 million transactions per day, 183 crores of worth of money being transferred on a daily basis. So that means, I mean, we have reached up to the last mile, right? Despite having challenges, internet, so on and so forth. I mean, I do visit panchayats, go to village, and I see everybody on the WhatsApp. So I also wonder where there is a lack of, connectivity. Obviously, it lacks somewhere, some pockets in the hilly area and all. But truly not that we still have a 7% UPI penetration, right? We definitely should have been far more than 7% if I see everybody from my village on Facebook and WhatsApp, correct? Right? So I think what government has done, they have done what they wanted to do in terms of the overall DBT, right? Direct benefit transfer, the web-based accounting, planning, etc., tracking of funds. Those are important things which they had to do. It's a taxpayers' money which they're doing it. I think what more they can do, so a couple of things. One is that how important IT is to you. A rural development alone will have a budget of more than 100,000 crores, right? And look at maybe the IT spend and the IT stack which you are running. Maybe it's dated. I mean, you have to look at those elements. While you have done the basic thing, but have you improved the life quality of residents in village, right? You don't want that people line up for a Manrega job, right? 100 rupees, 150 rupees per day. That's not improving the quality of life, just surviving, right? You are helping the people who need to be survived, right? So that's not the idea. So the idea is to look at, more and more IT, like, I'll agree with my panelists now in terms of livelihood, education, improving the quality of life. So a lot of things can be done. For example, look at SHGs, right? I forgot the statistics, right? How many SHGs we have in this country, right? They create a lot of products, but they are unable to sell, or they sell it very, very locally, right? So ministry is also thinking on the similar lines of creating e-commerce platform for them, right? Now look at the WhatsApp channel. Ministries are trying to create a WhatsApp channel right now, so that when we have these gram panchayats, so if we have a 250,000 gram panchayats, that means we have a 2.5 million elected representative, right? I'm not talking about selected. So elected representative, and everybody in the village should have a right to know what is my gram panchayat planning for me from a money which they are getting from various pockets, right? So that's where I think we will have a better uses of these channels, in terms of, how best we can leverage that. So I think some of those things government is thinking in a right direction, but moving at a speed, perhaps, they can really go fast in terms of, what they have to do. So yeah, a lot of opportunities, a lot of hope, I think, for a rural citizens, but yeah, we have to collectively put together industry, government, and everybody on the platform to bring a real change and move from welfare to, kind of improving the quality and the livelihood of the fellow rural citizens and residents.
Wonderfully said. I think two takeaways: that one, eventually technology has to be integrated, right? So it's not just MORD that is looking at rural. There are several other schemes, and technology can play that integrative role. And I think the point that you made is, I think we've used technology very well. And the numbers that you shared are astounding. I mean, mind-boggling to kind of see the amount of transactions that are happening. But moving from welfare to quality of life and for the whole of the family rather than individual slices is what technology could enable in a very interesting way. We have a certain set of views and interesting views coming in from the floor. But before I get there, Professor, if we were to take a zoom out view and from where you operate, where you get to see both the big picture and the pixel level details, would love to hear your thoughts.
I wish I had that omniscience because technology people and people working in academia can be pretty bad at predicting where things are. I mean, who would have thought? In 1998, I remember thinking that putting a camera on a phone is a rather ridiculous thing. Where's it going to go? And about 6 years later, Nokia became the biggest camera producer in the country. Beyond cameras, that became also the biggest dispersal of sensors across the globe. And that's where what Carlos said and what Ganesh said are very, very interesting. And what in the previous session, Soledad Priliman was saying, and that comes to what you are saying, is that what is most important is collecting data that you can trust. And trust is something which I want to go back to. There's talk about making the data privacy preserving, collecting it, and so on. What has happened with this big telecom growth and the big computing growth, the biggest exciting technology being this little cell phone, which carries as much computing power and much more than what put man on the moon, right?
Yep.
It's amazing how quickly we made that leap. If you look at the word, I think the first word that we are discussing is bending disruptive technologies. Now, disruption not always is good because disruption can break trust.
Yeah.
What we are really looking for is a data architecture where the data you collect is trustworthy. You can rely on its integrity, and you rely on the fact that it is very widely dispersed. The individual's data is not important. It's actually when it's integrated, you use the word integrated. When it's collected, that it becomes interesting. What Carlos talked about using deep learning techniques and machine learning techniques, you begin to see patterns which are not, even the best mind cannot see those patterns. And that's where you get the transformation happening. So while on the one hand, we are looking for this magical leap, we don't quite know which direction that leap is going to go. I mean, there's so many failed technologies we have put our faith into. Looking at it from the, very, far away view, I work in a branch of computer science where you're worried about verification. And in software verification, hardware verification, we're really interested in the invariance of the system rather than the particular things that are happening. And in that big invariant thing, you're looking at integrity and trust. So you're looking to build an architecture of trust so that the data you've collected, and India has had a very good record, very early adopter of coming up with exceedingly good series, I call it series data, right? Over the Planning Commission in its early days was very, very good at doing this. And what we might lose when we are so taken by flashy technology is that we lose the quality of data, which then goes and contaminates the kinds of policies we make. And so you raise this very interesting point. Why should everything trickle down to the village? We would like, and you made this point as well, that we'd like the person in rural India to be a generator of not data for consumption by merely one corporation to monetize it, but actually something which can transform the society, can transform the economy, and transform governance in general. So I'm going to stop there with some of these are things which worry me more that we are not looking at it.
Correct.
Where am I excited? Healthcare.
Mm.
I think that's where you're going to see really nice uses of collecting all these data from diverse sources, diverse populations. I love the idea of mapping it because you see it, in a geospatial context. You see densities, you see patterns emerging there, which, sitting, even the brightest bureaucrat wouldn't have imagined that.
Absolutely, Max. So, no, I think I'm just reflecting that somebody said data is the new oil, and
it is a new oil, but you just don't want to give it to the oil barons.
and two, you don't want contaminated oil as well, right? So you want something that you can use, right? So how do you get and you bring in a very interesting element here, that technology is as good as the person who deals with it, right? If you take away trust from it, and that's what the challenge is, right? When we ever try to do UPI payments in rural, and we said, hey, do a 1 rupee and see what it works. Once we try, twice we try, the guy says, no, it's not working. I don't want to lose my money. 1 rupee in my pocket is better than 10 rupee cash back. I'm happy with my 1 rupee, forget it. So the whole aspect of the human interaction with the tech, and therefore the trust, and therefore the data that it generates, becomes a very interesting aspect to.
Yeah, I've been saying this for several years, that trust is the only social currency. If you look at even all these, flashy technologies like Bitcoin, they're just trying to rebuild an architecture of trust.
Underlying trust.
And it's also the only social currency.
Wonderful. You want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add. So if you know why we have failed in pandemic, mostly if you have followed, 2020, and I have been seeing villages and all, the very single reason why government failed, because we never had a data. We didn't know where are those people, the migrants, where they're destined for, right? In places like Mumbai, Delhi, where they're coming. So, and obviously the data which we had, that lacked the trust, right? Because the data was captured for something else, right? For example, you capture a data for a benefit, you be assured it's not 100% correct data, right? So people leave villages, but they still would like to be in the PDS in their village, right? In the ration card, in the voter list, in the land records, right? They have their own interest. So the data about, the rural residents or citizens is very, very important. And the data is not only about that economical status and name and demographics, so on and so forth. Right? Data has to be comprehensive about the economic status, about the skills, about the interest of the individual and the family, so that we can plan, those kind of, employment, move from welfare. So for example, now IT companies are looking into tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? We are also looking at, in terms of developing that. But do I have a data? In terms of, whether I can pick up a one city, right? And then I see the particular city is still having a migration from other cities. So the whole purpose is defeated, right? Because I am looking at, the local, employment generation for local.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a point, valid point. Yeah.
Before we open up to the floor, Ganesh, I want to bring you in, looking at data from another angle, Ganesh. And you spoke about aspirations of young people, and therefore the information asymmetry that hits youth, right? Choices that they make, how can they make better choices? And therefore the role of data and tech there. It'll be interesting to get your angle on that.
No, I completely agree with that, because unfortunately, if you look at the failure of the first couple of years of the skills mission and even NSDC in India, I think it was primarily because we almost thought that if we set up a plumbing school and admit 300 students, everybody will be happy. But as you know, in the initial stages, hardly 12% took up jobs after that, because we did not bother to analyze what their aspirations were, what the data showed in terms of what they've been doing for 16 years of their life. So absolutely, I think the opportunities today to do analytics, literally like, predictive and prescriptive to see what people do, is a much better use of time. And then it will also optimize the cost that you take to get them a better job. I also want to go back to the earlier point on trust. Absolutely. Earlier missions failed because the trust wasn't there. People kept making promises and you didn't really see it delivered. But today, if you can get 80% of a slum getting a good job, if you can get an artisan to double his earning. In fact, we are now working with the Aspen Institute in Washington, DC. and doing a big initiative across 2 or 3 cities. Where we're just saying every slum child, how do we ensure their trust? The same thing applies when we're doing it in Jharkhand in one of the villages to see how can we get the trust, analyze what they need through data, and do very focused interventions. It takes time, it takes patience. But if we don't do that, we would have done a lot of stuff, but not achieved outcomes. So I think outcomes are very important. And particularly in rural India, where people may not complain that loudly, but they'll just go back into their shell.
Yeah.
We cannot afford to do that.
Yeah. Completely with you. Carlos, your take on this. I mean, I'm just thinking that when we say data for good, if you flip it around, there's also data for bad. Right? So how do we make sure that this whole trust factor that we're talking about, continues to remain in the good realm? And what should we be doing together to make sure that we're leveraging the power of good there?
Yes, thank you very much for putting this topic on the panel, Professor Prasad. I think it's very important. Trust is one of the most important things when looking for collaboration between human beings, whatever the interaction it is, and most importantly, when we're talking about data. So for us, trust have to do with 3 main topics or main subtopics. The first one is the privacy protection of the people, right? So we have something that is called privacy by design in data for good. So everything that we design, every tool that we design that is data-based has privacy at its center. We take, for example, different privacy methodologies such as differential privacy enhancing technologies that we're exploring in the future, like multi-party computation, that different data sources are combined in a decentralized way and produce an outcome without disclaiming what's the data source, for example. That's kind of the experiments that we are doing here. The second one has to do with the reliability when we're talking about methodology, right? Because whenever we're talking about technical aspects, it's important that the data that we use, and particularly if we're talking about policy making, where the life of people is in game, and when we're talking about public budgets, reliability is very important. So the methodology is something that we put a lot of attention in. We have state-of-the-art methodologies that we publicly publish in our website on how these data sets are created, so that everybody that uses understands what is the methodology behind, so that they can be incorporated into the policy research pipelines. And the second one is the co-creation of these tools. So we do not act on our own. We always are partnering with, for example, international organizations such as the International Organization for Migration, UNHCR, the European Commission, even government agencies around the world that provide us feedback on what is the data that they are needing, what are the data gaps, what are the perspective on the data tools that we're building. For example, we are co-creating an international migration data set with the IOM and the UNHCR that is going to be published by the end of this year. And just because it's very important for everybody to understand people movement. So that's the part of co-creation. And the third one, when we're talking about trust, is a trust that the data people are going to have and are going to build with policymakers and decision makers. And that can only happen if we create positive outcomes, as it was already said in this panel. These really have to change the people of life and have a tangible outcome for start creating trust between data people, technical people, and policymakers.
I think that is very well structured in terms of the way that we need to think about it. We will come back to the panel with a few questions. I have a couple of interesting comments that I want to draw from the floor. We have Vikas. Vikas is here. Hey, Vikas. Love to get your perspective on whatever has been discussed. What's resonating, what's missing?
Sure. I think I had one big piece which is missing, and I'd like to add on to that. You kept asking everybody to zoom out and to go into 2027, in the future. I'd actually like to zoom in, and actually go to a rural village, right? And really draw in, some experience from something we did back in rural Chhattisgarh. So when you go to this village and you go to this school, usually say it's up to class 8th, you'll probably find a bunch of teachers, 1, 2, 3, 4, if it's lucky, teaching all the subjects to maybe 100 odd students or 150 or 50, depending on the place. You go to class 5 and you have, say, 25 students sitting in the maths class. And out of those 25, you'll have 2, 3, 4, and then batches of such students who wouldn't get the maths from grade 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, right? So even if you get Einstein today, Meta or otherwise, and get him to teach that class 5, he'll fail, right? So now how does all of these concepts that we've been talking, technology, data, innovation, and so on, fit in and really solve this problem? And it's actually a shame we've not been able to solve it. We are going into the metaverse, but we haven't been able to solve this problem.
Yeah.
So 2017, I was advisor to the Chhattisgarh government, and I started a project. We brought in a lot of partners, did some very interesting work, struck upon something called adaptive learning technologies. And the other thing I want to highlight here is, apart from the technology innovation, which we get so excited about and then kind of forget the rest, I think we don't really talk so much on process innovation, right? So when you put this technology of adaptive learning is essentially, layman terms, the system will adapt to the learning level of the child, right? So first, the system will be able to figure out that, okay, this guy, grade 5, but learning level 3 in maths. Even in maths, across the concept trees, you'll be, somewhere on one tree and some class on another tree. And then from there, it'll start sort of helping you out and helping you with concepts, right? So you take in that technology. That was our first sort of success. We found that something like this exists. So we don't need to go to a new technology in 2027. It exists today. Now, how do you put this into the school, right? So there comes process innovation. So there are learnings where step into the shoes of the principal, of the teacher, of the child, of the parents, when you as an administrator are designing this whole thing. Usually what happens in the government is, okay, 100 crores have come in, 80 crores out of that will go into buying new computers for the school, which will, lie in the computer lab. Out of the 20 crores, it will get distributed into software training and, other things. And then nothing much happens, right? So in terms of process, one of the big problems we figured that the teacher already has so much load apart from the school, but also within the school. And in the school, now you've given the teacher a physical textbook and a digital textbook, right? And the teacher doesn't know how to integrate it. So you need a lot of process innovation there to sort of connect that together. And then a new kind of a teacher training program. Otherwise, the third learning we had was get a lot of young people to think about it, young because they don't have the experience. So in a lot of these problems, which we haven't solved in the last 50 years, our experience becomes the baggage,
right?
So a lot of times, I tried that 10 years ago, I tried that 5 years ago, but, if you try it with a different angle, it might just work with the new technology and new process. So I think, with all of this put together, we were making a lot of progress in this area. And then to close, the elections happened. That's the end of story.
That sounded like an anticlimax out there, but that's interesting because what you're trying to also zoom in is finally everything that we're talking here has to make a positive difference on the life of the individual here and now. And maybe that's the metric we were talking about, the positive outcomes that we should keep a hawk's eye on. Otherwise, it's easy to get romanticizing with technology without really looking at the benefit of that. We have one more gentleman, Amit. Amit, love to get your take. Yes.
Hi, I am Amit Jain. I have been a practitioner for tech for good and, as they say, data for good. Lovely to hear all the panelists here. Amazing. I would like to take 3 to 4 minutes, Madan, if you permit me. Of all the people who are sitting here, I have a question. What is the kind of economic value or even financial value we would like to attribute to 3 million years of life in Indian settings? 3 million years of life. What is the kind of value we would like to attribute it to? Any guesses, any numbers? 3 million, 30 lakh years of life in India, 30 lakh years of life in India Just the economic value to that. Rupee value, I mean to say. No dollar value, or maybe dollar value, whatever you feel like, comfortable. Any guesses? We are talking about capital, commercial, consumer, all of us. Meta also, and nothing to take away from Meta. Meta is operating at a level. DTL is operating at a level. MLT is operating at a level. So, any guesses? Okay. Simply multiply it by the per capita income that the government of India talks about. And you get a figure of $6 billion. It's not a small sum. $6 billion. Not a small sum. So why I've talked about that is the example that I'm going to share with you right now, a use case or a use setting for using the ML, the deep learning technology, techniques, etc., can be very, very effectively used for this kind of a setting in India today. And I'm restricting it to India. So, and this example of mine will take into account the rural that we talked about, the urban, the young and the youth, everything, all of those together.
Okay.
So drawing your attention to a very clear component. And by the way, if Ganesh is still here and Madan, I've always been, meeting them. I started Health Point several years ago when I was the GenPAC NASCOM winner as well and a global awards winner as well. And Action for India, we have been meeting Madan. So look at a situation where childhood cancer in India is 1/4 of the entire world. So there are 4 lakh cases, 400,000 cases of childhood cancer in the world every year, out of which 100,000 cases are in India. Not a large number, right? When we talk about millions in tuberculosis and 20 million in adult cancer, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately in India, the survival rate for childhood cancer is 25%. 25%. So out of 100,000 children, only 25,000 survive or reach to a care center, as compared to a 80% survival rate across the globe. That's all. So we would like to use such solutions by the combined, kind of efforts of the Meta, the IIT, the Head Held High Foundation, Ganesh and Deloitte, and all of us together to ensure whether we can reach out to survival rates which are better. And every single life saved here, which cumulates to a 3 million original figure that I started my dialogue with you, actually adds potentially $6 billion in our national per capita income year after year after year after year. And I'm not taking into account the income that may be per capita attributable to the families and children of these survivors. A very simple case, give a thought to that, and this will be throwing back amazing calculations to all of us. And by the way, childhood cancer is far more curable than adult cancers. And we'll be adding these 3 million years of life, productive life, to our own nation, India. So I just thought of, talking about a use case when we talk about a UPI or when we talk about a deep learning, machine learning kind of, constructs and meta kind of constructs. Thank you. I've taken my 4 minutes or so.
Thank you, Amit. No, that was a very thought-provoking question at a fundamental level, that it comes back to the quality of life and the whole aspect that there is an integration that is required. Each of us cannot operate in silos. And you mentioned that it's the whole of society approach in a way to improve the lives. We'll hold that thought and come back to some closing comments. But let me take 2 or 3 questions. And if you can keep the questions crisp, we'll take those 3 questions and then we'll come back to answering it in any form. We have a hand up there.
Hi,
Yes.
I'm Rahul. Studies after studies have sort of reflected the kind of biases that technology, and in particular artificial intelligence technology, that everyone seems to be just so excited about and is going to solve every problem that humans haven't been able to solve. In these sort of conferences and platforms, when we are speaking about technology and the promises of technology, how important it is to touch upon the limitations of technology and the kind of, especially racial, caste. We had a panel on gender biases that AI will perpetuate in the same level, sometimes even make it worse than humans.
Very valid question. Yes. Shobhat.
Hi. I think one point which I would want to raise is that how do we build the capacities of since we're talking about technologies for the social sector organizations, how do we build the capacities of the leadership teams to absorb and discuss and come up with solutions? Because they are the ones who are looking at the grassroots.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Yes.
Hi, I actually wanted to ask, because we have this discussion around how we can ensure data coming from the grassroots, right? So I also want to understand, and adding on to what he has asked, how do we ensure authenticity of this data that is coming from the grassroots? Because the capacity is not there, or the capacity building is required. So how do we ensure the authenticity?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start off with maybe with those three questions. You can address any of that.
I think I don't have an answer to the second question, which is the capacity building for the grassroots workers. But I am not gung ho about many of these flashy new technologies. In fact, our bread and butter in the verification community comes from spectacular failures, because that's then why they want to put research in our direction rather than give it to the the deep learning guys and so on. But to answer both the point that you made about the gentleman there about traction on the ground. I mean, if you ask something about how do I know this is secure and how do I know this is authentic, the answer nowadays is, oh, it's on a blockchain. How do you know that that blockchain reflects anything with reality? What is the friction between your digital image of things and ground reality? Luckily, this device is a pretty democratic device. It carries not just a camera, but it carries many other sensors. And when we talk about data, there's a lot of metadata which accompanies the data. And what this metadata can do, and unfortunately, it hasn't been exploited enough. I mean, it can be really exploited terrifically in the positive sense, is to give, grounding to what one set of sensors is capturing. For example, you take a photograph. With the photograph, we already know where that photograph was taken, when it was taken, what the shake in your hand was when it was taken, and so on. So both in the medical field, as well as in collecting information on the ground with sensors, for example, in a rural field, you can actually get a lot of extra data. And that's the kind of pattern that the folks at Meta and Google and where all these big guys really capture and they're able to exploit. I think what they need to do is work with governments and social agencies and all to take it all the way down to make sure that the kind of validation you want of the data is actually possible.
Yeah. And as a closing comment, Prof, if you just close your eyes and say, hey, 2027 or 2030 or whatever that year is, if you were to make a wild, I wouldn't say a prediction. Would you? That itself is a prediction that you wouldn't want to make a prediction because you know how difficult it is.
It is difficult, but it's also dangerous. I mean, the best research lab ever was Xerox PARC. They incubated some of the greatest ideas, and they couldn't see it. The researchers who worked on it could see that these were exciting research ideas, but they could not see what it meant. Right? And their managers absolutely couldn't see it. I wouldn't hazard guesses. I think the long-term things about what is it that we want to do with all this information we are collecting. I mean, after all, we've got this which has more power than could put a man on the moon. And what do we do with it? We make TikTok movies and we play, we send WhatsApp messages. So you cannot predict what human beings will do.
And that's a prediction by itself.
Madan, if I may jump in.
Yeah, let's get to Amit and then maybe we'll get to,
So I'll attempt the first question.
Ganesh and Carlos,
you come February and you say romance in the air, right? So nowadays AI is in the air. So I agree with you, gentlemen. So the point is, that if you talk to anybody, I mean, they are so blindly saying just AI, machine learning, please apply and it will solve the problem, right? Now you see the lens which they are looking at, right? So whenever a government guy will say AI, they will only say fraud prevention. Right. They will only say fraud prevention. Find those buggers who are digging the same pond under Manrega scheme for last decade. And they are using the same pictures from 6 different directions, changing the pixels using Adobe and all, so on and so forth, right? So it takes time for AI models to train, right? But our clients are expecting result yesterday, not tomorrow. So you are right. So in terms of, that you be careful and take the best advice from professor next to me in terms of what is possible, what is not possible, so that we also kind of, leverage the technology. So I think, so the idea is do not trust something blindly, whether it's a technology or person, right? Just make sure that you are applying it rightly.
Yeah. And do you want to make any wild predictions on the pond or the fraud? If you had to visualize.
So if I have to visualize 2027 or 37, so I would really like a rural citizen have all the powers in his hand, his or her hand, in terms of, right, to contribute. What has to happen is there in their villages, right? Whether road is important or whether school is important, right? How far they would like to go in terms of schools or, or the, hospital, so on and so forth, right? So I think as of now, it is more top driven. Government allocates money based on, certain formulas which were developed in 1947, right? Then the politics, and then you keep on, funding money every year, and then, you don't see the outcome. When it is a bottoms up approach, I think we'll see a real challenge. Yeah. Believe me, guys, I have seen few villages in Rajasthan and in southern part of the country so beautifully managed in terms of how they manage their planning, GPDP, the roads, infrastructure. So I'm sure if few can manage, many can follow.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Ganesh, couple of minutes as closing comments.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that, because I think sometimes we get overly cynical as well. And my own belief is that we have underinvested in technology, and then, you get the fringe benefits and you don't get the real benefit. So I would think that if you ask me for 2027, what I would love to see happen, I think clean data. I mean, somebody talked about, just getting data and somehow pushing some. That is what creates the problem. You work on wrong data, you're bound to get garbage in, garbage out. So cleaning up data, having data warehouses, data marts which are clean, even from the rural areas, very possible. That's why ONDC is there. Second is the point on AI and ML. And I think we should make sure that when we use AI, it's not like brute force, blind AI, but it is not autonomous. This country with so many people doesn't need autonomous AI. But if you look at assistive AI, augmentative AI, there are multiple use cases that are going to happen. But at the same time, I mean, I agree with you that if you use it wrong, you will get this whole bias that happens. I mean, whether it was towards gender or whatever. So if you're watchful for what it can do and what cannot do, you will make it happen. So my own belief is, if we realize that artificial intelligence is not a substitute for natural stupidity, we will work with the technology to make change happen. And I'm very hopeful that will happen in this country.
Super. Thank you, Ganesh. That are really positive words to end with. Carlos, you have the last word.
Thank you. Just very quickly on the limitations. Whenever we're talking about policy topics, it's very difficult that we're going to have just one data set that is going to be the answer to all the questions that we are asking ourselves. There is no silver bullet data set. There's no silver bullet tool that is going to answer the questions. So we have to be clear about that. And as data providers, we are always trying to encourage the addition of new data layers to the data that we have. So it's more like an ecosystem that is evolving and that adds new data layers to find the insights that we are looking. And once we have these data layers in place, then we will require definitely human beings, because one thing is data and another thing is the interpretation of data. And for the interpretation of data, we require local expertise. You cannot come like from a national wide or international perspective and say like, this is the data, this is what's happening. That's very limited. What you need is to provide the data and encourage local expertise to put the data into context and activate it in the best possible way. In terms of capacity building, I think it's a change in mindset from my perspective. We need to stop seeing data science and data scientists as a career on its own, but rather as a tool that can support all the other careers and all the other pathways that we have, right? So from my perspective, what I would like to see is more and more careers, more and more government officials and people working in these government agencies to acquire data set skills to process data and also to interpret data from more technical teams. So not seeing data science as a career on its own, but rather as a tool that can support government work and policy work too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. And just wanted to address one question that Shobit you asked, and maybe there's an answer there. I was meeting somebody, work with a friend at Flipkart in the early days. He was saying that irrespective of which function they were hiring for, it could be finance, admin, ops, HR, it didn't matter. Apparently, every applicant went through a tech interview, right? Because they said, listen, we have to solve for things at scale. So if an admin guy is not thinking of tech on how do we solve when we have 100,000 employees across multiple offices, you're not going to cut it at Flipkart. So they said they made tech thinking a culture, right? It's not that he need to know coding, but can he think scale and can he think at least saying, yeah, I can use technology to solve it, right? And I think that is what required in the institutions and in the social sector, that how do we think tech first? Or how may not be first. How do we put that tech thinking to solve problems at scale? And from that will emerge all the other contours that we need to be thinking about. Otherwise, if we keep it as the last item, we'll never get there, right? And I think that's a critical learning that I had. So with that, I think we've got a fascinating discussion that's sort of gone on and on, with the various perspectives that we have. If I were to hazard a guess, or if I were to look at myself and say, hey, where would I ideally want it to be? I would want tech to put the power of power in the hands of the common man, right? Today, I hear a lot of youth, people in the village when I go say, sir, hum kya kar sakte hai? What can I do, right? And I want to be able to reverse that to say, listen, you have the power in your hands to make a difference. Right? Can you then exercise that power and can you build systems where the voice of that person in the last, standing in the last in the queue can be heard? And can that be amplified? And can we then, given that we're talking about the India rural colloquy coinciding with the whole Quit India movement, can we use technology to say poverty, quit India? Can we use technology to say inequality, quit India? Can we use technology to say injustice, quit India? And I think if we can combine the power of everything that we have and co-create with them, I think we truly have an opportunity to make democracy come alive and happiness come alive at every nook and corner of the country. And I think that's the power of tech that we need to visualize. So with that, a huge thank you to Carlos, Ganesh for joining us online, for Amit and Professor Prasad. Thank you so much. I think what we've begun here is just the beginning and the seeds of a conversation. We look forward to bending it even more as we go along. Thank you. Bend it like Beckham. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for such an enriching session. I'll now invite Aliva for the closing comments.
Can we have the colloquial anthem?
Yeah, so I request everyone to please be seated. We still have the closing session to go on, and we would like to begin it by the anthem song. And it's actually a bittersweet moment, 1 year till we hear it again. So hearing it for 2022 for the last time.
आजादी की बात रही वो लेके रहेंगे
सौगंध उठाते हैं सशक्त राष्ट्र के सपने को चलो मिलकर आज सजाते हैं। हर युवा को रोजगार मिले, हर नारी की आजादी हो, हर घर स्वास्थ्य सबल बने, ये गली गली मुनादी हो। जन जन स्वाभिमानी हो, देश में ना रहे गरीबी, विकास ही अपनी निशानी हो। एक क्रांति फिर ऐसी हो, रगों में वही रवानी हो, कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर सबने बस यही ठानी हो। सौगंध उठाते हैं सशक्त राष्ट्र के सपने को चलो मिलकर आज सजाते हैं। हर युवा को रोजगार मिले, हर नारी की आजादी हो, हर घर स्वास्थ्य सबल बने, ये गली गली मुनादी हो।
So we can actually have a second round of applause for our very own Amjad, who is the lyricist of this song. Good evening, everyone. I would like to start by thanking you all, particularly the panelists, for the excellent thought-provoking talks, the session moderators for organizing and animating the sessions and keeping things both under control and reasonably on time. However, most importantly, I would like to thank you all, the participants. Without your input, ideas, and discussion, this colloquy would not have been the success that it has been. Now, I would request the session anchors to come forward to share a few key takeaways from each of the sessions that they had anchored. May I now request my dear colleagues Anirban, Mala, Ashok, Neeraj, Vinay, Gajanan, Shirish, Anushri, Gauri, Charvi, and Nirja, who is joining us online. Maybe each of us, you can take a minute or two to share the key takeaways from each of the sessions that you anchored, and we can go in the sequence of the session. So we can start with Anirban.
Yeah, the first opening session was great. I think the two takeaways I took from, it was a session which can be transcribed. And it was really, I don't know how many of you have Googled up the references which were made, and all of them are extremely readable, people and documents which were referred. So I think the two takeaways which I took, and it is interesting that the last session, the first session and the last session talked about trust. The first session talked about the gaps in trust while we are building a new society. The last session talked about trust in data. I think it's a circular, and possibly that's where, if we want to have rural different, we need to think about trust issues around different kinds of domains and different kinds of spaces we are engaged upon. So this was one big takeaway in the first. And the second big takeaway which I had was this whole conversation around commons. And typically in rural areas, and with the kind of time we started our rural development programs, so we looked at commons only in the nature of the land and the commons and the pastures in the villages. But the whole discourse about commons is global, including, I think, for data there is this whole issue of commons. And as TRI, we need to look far more deeper into this issue of commons and the whole underlying normative issues around commons. And possibly that's an area we haven't worked much in TRI, but that's an area to work with. So these were my two takeaways from the first session. Thank you.
So the second session was Design for Better World, and I was actually anchoring that session. So, so for me, the major takeaways were how can we redesign our institutions, from institutions of power and politics to institutions for people and planet, to build more inclusive societies, and how design thinking can help us to understand the human behavior and human aspirations, and this this capacity does have a tremendous potential in creating more robust programs with significant purpose. Lastly, the biggest key takeaway or the thought that I had was, if these design capacities can be taken to the tripod that we have been talking about, the PRI, LAC, and CBO, it has a huge potential to alter their and our ways of thinking, planning, and doing, and has a huge potential for opening a whole new world of possibilities. So this is it. Then the third session, I would like to call Mala to come. Mala and Ashok for the third day.
Hi. The third session also drew from Manirban's session of trust. So I'll let you know, guys, what our key takeaways from that were. The session New World of Data Science for Effective Public Systems Delivery highlighted contours or behavioral aspects of data culture, data literacy, data quality, and public trust in available public data. Our panelists brought forward key capacities and specializations related gaps with current handling of public intent data, and how enabling these gaps would create a basis for evidence-based decisions and policy making. Seeing the status quo and taking from the insights of the discussion, Trif and Sambodhi have planned to devise, and I'm very happy to share that with you guys, what we are currently calling the Data Fellowship, with a vision of making public intent data more actionable, governments more data-driven, bring improved data literacy and data culture into systems, and impact public policy in action. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hello. I was there in the session of Future of Food Systems, and my key takeaways are like feminization of agriculture. Basically, the kind of work we are doing with SHG women, and one of the key messages came from the panels that with these 8 million SHGs, the agriculture can be transformed, and this is where we need to do something seriously. Second is about human capacity in agriculture. Since now agriculture is going to be with women and the kind of people who are doing it, and the new kind of agriculture needs human capacity investments in people. So it requires serious human investment in agriculture, those who are engaged, youth or women or whoever is doing agriculture. Third is about climate and agriculture. With the kind of conventional agriculture, our soil and water, these are all depleting, and agriculture is one of the biggest contributor in climate change. So we have to think of how this climate sensitive agriculture can be promoted and how it can contribute towards bringing climate resilience in farming. And fifth is about the diversity. So it is, I think we talked today also about this, about the cereal production to some other kind of agriculture. So right solution for the right kind of context, not that one green revolution is going to fit across India. So we have to look for solutions across the different kind of geography and this people sector and area. So all these things to be considered for designing solutions. So diversity in agriculture and this small production and the large production. So how these two things can be linked. And here comes the role of markets and the role of different solution providers like different businesses can play a big role in for new kind of agriculture. And one takeaway that came very strongly was that there is a great potential for like joint stock companies or different farmer producer organizations. Those are coming. So perhaps they may bring new kind of agriculture for smallholder farmers. So thank you. Yeah, this.
Quote again, Anirban for the Big Society Compact to Deliver Sustainable Development.
Again, two takeaways which came up. It was again an excellent panel, and one was, I think today morning also there was a reference to that. How can capital markets be used to reinvest and invest in rural India? And possibly we have already translated a bit of that today with IntelliCap and TRI starting fund, which looks at having orchards and plantations for 1 million farmers. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll have significant amount of private capital investments going into deep rural areas in India. So that was one takeaway, that to understand the way people are curating, financial products in a manner that capital markets can actually invest in rural areas. The second takeaway, which I looked at, is that there are several places where we still don't know solutions, and therefore deep engagement with communities are required to come up with solutions which work for them. So possibly the TRI action pilots were designed for that, and there needs to be deeper work in those spaces to come up with solutions around issues where actually India doesn't have solutions. So those were my two big takeaway from those that Power Pact session anchored by Rohini. Thanks.
With Neeraj for Ignorance is No Bliss session.
Right. So this session actually focused on, the young people of our country, and I couldn't help notice, across all the sessions, be it India at 100 or food security or net zero resolve or technology, we actually talked about young people of this country in almost every session in this. So we have, we really placed high expectations on our young for the future of this country. So this was really a very interesting session for me, and I had three key takeaways from this session. First of all, it focused on an asset-based approach rather than a challenging approach as to how can we see young as an asset, and the aspirations and energy of young people can be galvanized for the development of this country. So one was, how we can involve the youth in designing and implementation of programs. So whether it be youth advisory group or, youth hubs like, safe spaces or, demand-driven skilling programs. So how can we involve young people more into designing programs so that we do things for the young people, involving young people. Nothing for the youth without the youth. The second was, reaching out and engaging youth, especially from the marginalized and vulnerable segment of the community. So, again, talked about safe spaces for women to engage and, then have a career dialogue to stimulate job experiences with them, to think beyond the government jobs as the only rewarding or vulnerable careers. So how can we stimulate different job experiences? How we can have a stimulating career dialogue with them, and in a form that young people can the young people can digest the information. And third, very important point in this again theme was something like a rural LinkedIn. So how can we create a space where young people can actually know and constantly take informed decisions for their careers. Lastly, was, how can we develop? So young people basically have different perspectives, different contexts, different challenges at personal, societal, and systems level. So how can we, understand these different contexts and develop solutions which are customized for these young people and can be replicated at scale? So these were the three key takeaways, from the session, and I would like to conclude it with a quote. So George Bernard Shaw once famously said that youth is often wasted on the young. So let us not be a country or the system which makes youth be wasted on the young. Thank you.
For the sixth, Nirja, if you're online and you can, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nirja, and on behalf of TRIF, I'll present some key takeaways from the session Nutrition Security for India and the Agriculture and Community Unlock. This session began with key findings from India's first ever large-scale food plate mapping survey conducted by our Development Intelligence Unit. And it was observed that most affluent states are also the least diverse, and habit was a major reason for the lack of diversity. And going forward and connecting to this survey, some key takeaways for us were, first, that there is consistent relationship between poverty and malnutrition, along with monitoring of diets by public health authorities. There's also need to push for nutrition sensitive agriculture through policy instruments and public action. Second was the intersection of food, nutrition, climate change, and gender. So between production and consumption, there are a lot of things that go on in a household into acquisition and preparation of food, such as fuel, water, energy, etc., which are a continual daily investment and a burden for which often falls on women, which we need to recognize and address. And third is, along with all the efforts, it is also equally important to fortify existing diets and crops that are part of people's diets and habits already, and develop cost-effective, scalable ways to promote nutrition security around this. So we at TRIF are extremely committed to incorporate these learnings in an intensive way in our work through People Public Panchayat model for addressing nutrition security. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirja. Ganeshji, for giving voice to issues on margins and or marginalized.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's been a great day today. I was down with COVID and I thought I'll come for a few hours, but I couldn't go because all the sessions were so absorbing. The session on giving voice to issues on margin and the marginalized, what can the media get right? I think we had three very illustrious media persons who spoke about, and we selected people who were actually doing a lot of work to mainstream, the work of the issues of marginalized. And I think what we really got from them was my three takeaways would be, one was that I think we found that there was sufficient appetite amongst the media outlets if the stories of human interest which had impact were kind of created and creatively developed and supported by a lot of data. So this whole idea that there is no market for stories from the rural areas is probably not as adequate as we found. And we also saw that some of these people who came have created a niche market for themselves as far as this market is concerned. So that is something which I thought is very encouraging, and particularly for those of us who are interested in trying to, mainstream some of this work in the rural areas would be very interesting. The other thing which I found was very interesting was that, NGOs which are flooded with very, fascinating stories about development and lot of good work that's happening in the rural areas. They need to learn how to, present these stories to the media. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to effectively collaborate, particularly with those media houses where there is scope for such stories. And I think, one of the things that one of them said was to convert the ordinary into extraordinary. So if you invest in the stories that we do, I mean, very often, the other day we had a seminar, we brought in some 8 or 9 NGOs, and they were all saying that we do such a lot of good work, it doesn't get noticed. So I think the main takeaway for me would be to creatively engage with the media folks and learn how to present these stories to them, rather than expecting that they don't pick these stories. Obviously, there is a bias there, but that bias can be addressed. And I think, thirdly, I also found that apart from stories of despair and stories of, exploitation and, that are generally talked about, if there are stories of hope and generally celebration of rural life, they don't have to be stories of very great impact. General stories, if they're written well, I think they'll get traction. So thank you.
Gajanan for Sustainable Rural Growth.
Yeah, so there are 3 specific takeaways for me, which I would like to take in the action that we do along with the government. One is that there is an increased trust of the government in terms of when we started our work, it was whole of rural development. Then it transited to whole of government. And today we learned about whole of society approach, which is a very good initiative. And I treat it as a momentum investment. And we must build on this momentum and try to see how this benefit can reach to our rural families. Second, from the panel that we could understand today is the potential of technology that the government is trying to invest in. Madam was talking about the digitized way of livelihood planning. And I think that can truly change the way that livelihood planning is being made, because many of things can be interrelated. There could be much of IT that will interact with each other. So a lot of benefit we can take from that. So building on the digitized planning process. And the third thing, which is a major takeaway for me, was like, which would shift our original idea of, building livelihoods and the basics, which would try to shift from low value to high value livelihoods, be it agriculture, be it horticulture, or be it an enterprise. So we must see where the profitability is high. So I think we as a practitioner need to learn all that and try to scale it wherever it is possible. These are the 3 takeaways for me. Thank you.
Sirish for India's net zero resolve.
Yeah, hi everyone. So the session was built up really well from defining what exactly is net zero, and the panel actually thought it's not defined well. To actually then looking at an overarching confluence of how Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar can respond to how we achieve our net zero resolve. It was discussed that the net zero definition should actually be more inclusive and should not focus only on the technical aspects of climate change mitigation, and should also be de-jargonized so that the Samaj part of it can actually understand, given how diverse a country that we are. The key takeaway then from the session was the role of Samaj Sarkar Bazaar as it was intended, and a lot of discussion happened around how MSMEs actually are an important lever into this entire process, and how the market should actually respond to this crisis. So right now, the entire discussion and debate around this is centered around mitigation of climate change, and which needs to shift to adaptation and building resilience for climate change.
Apart from that, the session ended on a good note with hopes of what actually is packaged with hopes for what actually holds for our future in terms of climate change. And the session ended with a key declaration from TRF and IntelliCap on climate finance platform, as Anirban also mentioned while he spoke, for 1 million smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Anushri for the future of civil society.
Hi. So a lot of discussion for the panel that I was anchoring was around the future that civil society holds in India. And a lot of the discussion initially moved around the role that civil society plays in the system, and especially in our country. And we started with understanding how it bridges the gap between Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar by bringing in the balance that is required to bring in, and also the role that it plays within the state. So that is something which the session started with. Some major takeaways that we have about something that we talk a lot in TRIF is around bringing in inclusiveness about even the events that we do or the programs that we run. So a lot of conversation moved around, bringing in small grassroots level CSOs also to be part of the discussions to understand their challenges as well. And also how we can break the barrier of language, something we talk a lot about in our discussions also here in TRIF. And then there was discussions around that, then there were discussions of future. Obviously, that was the whole point. So there was discussions around how association and collaboration is only the way ahead for CSOs when they work, and how CSR firms are going to get mature with time, and the discussions would be more around impact and less around the targets and numbers that are being focused right now. So yeah, that is it. These were the takeaways for me from the session. Thank you.
Gauri for gender justice for present times.
Good evening, everyone. In terms of takeaways from the session, I'd like to start with the viral video that Sunita had reminded us about. The one where men are taking oaths for seats reserved for women in a panchayat in MP. We need to reflect on why that happened. Solida talked about how historically there has been a challenge of access to and influence in political spaces for women. She also mentioned that on matters of politics, men influence 5 times more people and have 3 times more access to people than women do. Seema also talked about that despite the efforts of a national rural livelihood mission, decision-making continues to be a challenge for women at households. Given that TRI is an organization that largely works with and for rural women, it brings me back to Gagan's question. Are we empowering and building leadership where women get space to deepen democracy? Are we willing to create political spaces where women can claim their rights at their own homes, at panchayats, from the government and from the markets? I believe we are, and our new unit on inclusion and equality will take us closer towards a better relationship and a life for all of us across the spectrum of gender and sexualities. Thank you.
Sharvi for bending emerging disruptive technologies for prosperity pathways in Bharat.
Good evening, everyone. So this was the last session, and it's quite fresh in our minds. But so we started with talking about the global challenges like climate change and pandemic, and how that needs to be addressed through technology. So I think that is a huge opportunity for us in terms of how job creation and climate change opportunities can be tapped into. The second major key takeaway, I think, is we talked a lot about trust as well. And I think trustworthy data authentication and widely dispensable data, I think, is quite necessary for having, and in terms of having machine learning techniques and something that can transform the economy into tangible outcomes. So I think these two were major takeaways for me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So before the vote of thanks, just to summarize the key takeaways. So the colloquy for all of us in TRIF was not just an idea fest, but also gave us an opportunity to reflect on the work that we do and how we can become better at doing what we are already doing. In all humility, I realized that how little do we know and how much knowledge is out there. And how can we harvest these ideas to create the rural India that we have envisaged for ourselves. In a way, this colloquy is going to be like a North Star, which will guide us in the days ahead in whatever we will be doing as development practitioners. So the future looks bright indeed. With this, I request Ankita to please share a vote of thanks.
चेयर में बैठिए कुछ में बैठिए आप लोग बैठिए जल्दी चेयर में बैठ जाइए We need to do this quickly. Thank you. Just 1 minute. So now that so Madan, I would thought on these takeaways. Just we'll take a few seconds. Sure. Just thinking that.
Yeah, you're audible.
Well, I think it's a wonderful set of takeaways. If you can distill it into either principles or maxims that each of us as professionals and passionate people working in the space, if it can emerge like the 10 commandments from the colloquy, right? If you can say, what is it that I have to change in my thinking on a daily basis? If it can be distilled out and shared, I think it will be super powerful. From each of the sessions, one commandment that we can go with.
Right now?
No. You seem to be ready to go. Yes.
You missed it. It's not right now. Yesterday.
Ankita, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's been a wonderful day and a great week. I really hope that all of you have enjoyed because the sessions have been very, very insightful. On behalf of Team Colloquy, I extend my hearty vote of thanks to one and all who have been part of India Rural Colloquy. Very grateful to our conversationist and audience for infusing life and meaning to these conversations that matter to rural communities. Together, all of us had made this colloquy meaningful. I'd like to also thank Iridium, Global Lancers, Teamwork, S3 Infomedia, India Habitat Center, Enrollens, and all of our TRIF partners and mentors for their endless efforts to make this happen. Inspired minds, our hearts filled with gratitude. We look forward to transform rural India. Thank you so much, everyone.